Hi, I'm Martyn Heyne and welcome back to part 2 of this double episode about the spaced pair or the AB stereo recording technique. Here's a link to video 1 in case you've got no idea what I'm on about. Okay, so we've been discussing some different parameters that we need to consider when setting up the microphones. This next one I want to start with today is the recording angle of the microphone setup. You can picture this recording angle as sort of a light beam coming from the microphones. This can be a wider beam or a narrower focus. Inside the beam are the things that will be translated as coming from between the two speakers in the reproduction. They make up the stereo image. Things outside the beam will be crammed together as coming only from the outside of the stereo image or only from one speaker. This is okay for part of the ambience, but is to be avoided for the direct sound. If you have a large ensemble or a choir, you also want to make sure that you use the whole width of the stereo picture. If you have a 60-piece orchestra and they just fill half of the stereo image, it's not going to be nearly as impressive as if they would fit the whole picture. So for large ensembles especially, you want to get this exactly right. For smaller ensembles or soloists, like a classical guitar for example, it's a bit different because you're not going to blow that up across the whole width. Instead, focus the spotlight nicely on the room and have the guitar or the soloist well centered in the middle. In that case, it's a bit less critical to choose the recording angle. With this in mind, a good angle depends on the width of the stage that you want the light beam to cover, as well as the distance that the microphones are from the stage. If you have, for example, a 90-degree angle like this, that means here are the microphones and this is the light beam or the recording angle. And let's say this is the stage. Then at this distance, if the microphones are at this distance, the angle is too wide because there is stuff here and here that is not being used. Now as you get closer, here you have the ideal angle or the ideal distance for this angle rather. And now the angle begins to cover too little of the stage. Perfect, too wide. If the distance to the stage, and I'm using the word stage here to mean the outside edges of whatever sonic event you wish to cover. So if the distance to that stage is largely decided by the reverb ratio, then you have to adjust the recording angle to get the correct coverage. Basically, the further you move from the stage, the wider the microphone spacing will have to be in order to accommodate the distance. But which settings create which angles? Unfortunately, there's no straightforward answer to this, but generally speaking, as you move the microphones further apart, the recording angle gets narrower. So the beam that will translate as the space between the speakers gets narrower and creates a sort of zooming in effect that will now blow up a smaller acoustic event into a bigger picture between the speakers. So, mics further apart, narrower angle, wider reproduction. And conversely, mics closer together, wider recording angle, narrower reproduction between the speakers. This part you can rely on, but what is the angle exactly? This is harder to answer because our perception of the time differences and the phase differences that you create in an AB setup is not always the same for different types of sounds. A percussive sound with a strong transient may need less of a time difference to translate as coming from further off to the side than a washier or more complex sound. So different types of signals that are coming from the same location in reality may end up sounding as if they're coming from a somewhat different location in the reproduction. With a level difference, you can roughly say that 18 dBs or more is enough to make a signal appear as coming from fully off to the side. So you think that only one speaker is playing it, even though the other speaker is also playing it, just 18 dBs or more softer. And the question now is, how much of a time difference is necessary for the same effect? For very transient signals, I've seen some literature specifying time differences as low as 0.6 milliseconds, but considering that music is a more complex signal, values of 1 millisecond to 1.5 milliseconds are quite a common assumption, and personally I tend more towards the latter. I'm just going into such detail about this, by the way, so that you can understand that there's no clear-cut mathematical solution to this question. By the way, this signal dependency is of course also the reason why the clarity of localization is not so strong in AB and gets washier towards the sides, because towards the sides the time difference and therefore the signal dependency increases. Okay, so based on a time difference of 1.5 milliseconds for a signal that's fully off to the side, we get the following recording angles. Up to a microphone spacing of 50 centimeters, you have a recording angle of 180 degrees, or half a circle in front of the microphones. So everything in front of the array should probably translate okay and not be outside of the beam. Anything smaller than that will also give you an angle of 180 degrees, but result in a smaller picture in the reproduction. Now, as you go wider with the mics, the angle narrows like this. 60 centimeters, 118 degrees. 70 centimeters, 95 degrees. 80 centimeters, 80 degrees. Good to remember this one. 90 centimeters, 70 degrees, and 1 meter, 60 degrees. Again, these can only be for general orientation and serve as a starting point to be verified by listening. Personally, I will also say that I've not had any luck with microphone spacings under about 30 centimeters and above a meter. Although I've certainly seen bigger and smaller setups, including my mortal enemy, the 17.5 centimeters. So it seems that it's not unusual to test these extremes as well. After about 1.20 meters, I would start referring to it as a dual mono setup, which can also be cool, especially if you like a lot of reverb and you're trying to keep some clarity in the center. It's just that I think we're leaving AB territory there. Let's talk about another aspect that is influenced by the microphone spacing, and that is the stereo reproduction of the low end. As I've mentioned in this video about the audio signal, the wavelengths at the extremes of human hearing span a wide range indeed. Between 1.7 centimeters and 17 meters. So you can see that as the frequencies get lower and the wavelengths get longer, a microphone spacing of 20 to 100 centimeters will at some point cease to create a relevant shift in the phase relationship between the two channels. This is by no means necessarily a bad thing. Mix engineers will often spend considerable effort sorting out the stereo image of the low end in a complex mix. This means getting it to be centered while also having the correct amount of energy in the different tonal regions. This aspect is basically taken care of somewhat naturally in a good spaced pair recording. However, consider that the closer the microphones are, the higher up in frequency this monoing effect will be. Now, one note about the height of the main pickup. There are again several considerations for this, such as the instrumentation in the room, and these are also relevant to other types of setups, not just AB, so I might get into detail about this a bit more in the future. But some observations already now. Most people who are new to this type of approach will set up the main pickup too low. A box standard mic stand, as you'd use on a live singer, is not going to work. You need a solid tripod that gives you some stable height. 2.5 meters plus minus a half a meter is a good starting range. Problems with floor reflections will be better the higher up you go, so err on the high side. Of course, the room's ceiling, as well as the way the instruments radiate sound, could be limiting factors. Okay, so I've mentioned a list of different parameters that we want to balance with the spaced pair. Let's do some quick examples. By the way, for any calculations, these small and inexpensive laser measuring devices are an absolute godsend. They allow you to measure large distances quickly and discreetly without much running around. Also super helpful to document what you've been doing, sizes, distances, and so forth. I recommend. Now, for a large group of musicians, it would make sense to first ascertain the correct distance to achieve a good reverb balance, then set the microphone spacing and thus the recording angle so that the musicians fill the entire stereo image. In that case, you would let the other parameters fall where they may. If, however, you wish to have a clearer sense of distance within the group and prioritize this by moving the main pickup closer, then you can set up a pair of room mics to harvest additional reverberation and ambience for the mixing stage. Second example, you record a solo church organ. In that case, I would like to make sure that I have a wide low end and therefore a pretty wide microphone spacing. Then again, you could set the distance to achieve a good reverb balance, and you would let the stereo angle fall where it may. Of course, it's always good to make sure that the parameters that you didn't prioritize don't end up being totally off. This is just a good example of where the recording angle is not paramount. A third example could be a string quartet or a soloist. In that case, the sound source would not be particularly large, and it would be good to make sure that it keeps some sense of directness and to make sure that it doesn't appear too inconcrete. In this case, it would be good to err on the side of a narrower microphone spacing, to definitely not have a void appear in the middle of the stereo image and keep some sense of directness. Alright, finally I would like to address two types of distortions that are to be expected not only but also with this type of recording. Firstly, imagine you have a choir standing in a straight line in front of the microphone array. Then in the playback it will sound as if the singers in the center are closer to the listener and the outer edges more distant, which indeed they were in real life relative to the microphones. This results in a line that sort of bends away from the listener in the playback. Conversely, if you arrange the choir to stand in a bent line or part of a circle around the microphone array, then this recording will translate as them appearing to stand in a straight line in the playback. Distortion number 2. The center of the stereo image from a spaced pair recording will be enlarged somewhat and the sides crammed together. This effect will get stronger the wider the microphone spacing is. Again, for a small sound source this may not be an issue, but for the choir analogy you could attempt to counteract this phenomenon by making the singers stand closer together in the center and then gradually space them further apart towards the sides. This is just to illustrate the distortion, by the way. In real life I would never attempt to make a singer do anything. Okay, I think that about covers it. In conclusion, as we can see, there are many different parameters that must be balanced in order to achieve the best possible results with an AB stereo recording. As the recordist, you have to recognize what the music's priorities are and make your settings accordingly. And remember, this is just one single stereo technique. We haven't even gone into all the other microphone techniques and other microphone types. So as you can see, and this may be my overarching point, the very common idea that one can simply record a real-world event with microphones and then play it back and have that playback recreate the same sonic experience for the listener as the real thing is simply not accurate as soon as you start looking at the details. We're always creating a new and different variation of the event. In the best case scenario, this new version is musically coherent. A technically faithful representation of reality, however, it can never be. And that's fine, we can still enjoy recordings for what they are, especially since most of the time we couldn't possibly have been there. That's it for today. Thank you very much for listening. As always, if you have further questions or your own experiences to share, please do so in the comments. Also, please feel free to forward this video to your recording friends and make sure to subscribe here and turn on the notifications for future episodes. Thank you very much. Goodbye.